find a big space between these two good speakers, so I'm going to rely on the audience to help us out. But let me ask a question that hasn't been asked to both Checker and Doug. Doug ended with, the Checker, excuse me, ended with 5 positive things. And, certainly Doug made a good case, strong case, that networking and maturity, which is the question we asked. 10 years later, what have we learned and what's the state of affairs for charter schools? The word neither of you mentioned is unions. There's a lot of debate and a lot of jockeying and a lot of uncertainty, it seems to me, about whether charter schools will be, should be unionized by teachers and other unions, and how that would work when it happens, and in some places it has happened. So when we talk about institutions and change, I wonder, maybe Checker, you would go first to say, if I've got that right, where does that stand? What's the trajectory? What are the important things to be thinking about in terms of the unions and their role?
Well, obviously it's an important question. The teacher unions are having to change to accommodate an enormous number of developments that are occurring in American education right now. I predict that by far the most powerful one is going to turn out to be technology and virtual schooling as something which completely leaps the boundaries of districts and states and redefines the entire organizational framework of American education away from the district base that is the center of union membership and political influence. And I'm not sure what collective bargaining, for example, is going to mean if half the courses a kid is taking are being taught by somebody on the other side of the planet. And the kid might not be sitting in a building called a school while taking those courses. This changes everything we're accustomed to thinking about staffing and HR in public education. And unions are going to have to figure out what that means for them. It's incidentally one of the reasons why they're pushing back against technology even harder than they're pushing back against school choice. I think they see what it might mean for them, and they don't much like it. The unions are having to accommodate to results-based accountability, standards, testing, accountability, no child left behind, call it what you like. Enormous shift in all the assumptions of teacher employment. You mean we're going to be judged by our results rather than by our seniority? Shocking. Huge change. The school choice in all of its forms, that phenomenon that got me up to 50% a few minutes ago, not just charters. I mean, homeschooling, virtual schooling, magnet schooling, inter-district public school choice, statewide public school choice. You can go on at vouchers in half a dozen places. You can go on at considerable length. Another major change in the entire historic assumption, the sort of 1957 system against which Albert Shanker and others were reacting when they gave birth to big-time teacher unionism in the 60s and 70s. So I think this is a very interesting time for teacher unions, and frankly, I think charters are just one tip of a multi-tipped iceberg here.
Do you want to comment? And earlier today when we were talking, you expressed a view that might stimulate some interest on virtual schools. Where do they fit in in relation to charter schools? So you might react to Checker about what's changing, particularly for the unions and the labor movement in the education field, but also, as he did, comment on virtual schools.
Sure. Well, I would just say that the first thing about any school or school system is it is only as good as the quality of its teachers. And I think there are a lot of different ways to maximize teacher quality. We're only, if our teachers are happy and feel contented and valued and we treat them like gold, that's the only way that we're going to be successful, and that's our goal as an organization. Is just to teaching is the hardest and the most important job in the world, and if we don't make people feel incredibly happy inside of our organizations, we're not doing our job, and that's just the way we think about managing our On virtual schools, I'm hesitant. I said at lunch. I feel like I'm a little bit hesitant to talk about virtual schools because I don't know that much about them. I do think there's a fascinating book that just came out by Clay Christensen, who's a HBS professor, a Harvard Business School professor, about the potential of virtual schooling as a disruptive innovation to customize, as Tom Carroll was saying. The way of all services right now and all products is the increased capacity for people to customize the things that they want. So it's an incredibly rich possibility. I also think it has downsides. One of the things that potentially concerns me is the potential for disparate impact, which is I wonder if virtual schools, when it's not virtual technology seated in an existing school, but rather a virtual school, relies to some degree implicitly or explicitly on the parent to proctor, supervise, teach. And as soon as you do that, to me, you have the issue of disparate impact. If you're relying on the parent to supervise, teach, et cetera, and the parent has, it's not an English language speaker, there's a question of educational equity to me.
By the way, Dick, speaking of books, John Chubb and Terry Moe have a brand new book out about 2 months old on the very same subject from Jossie Bass that is well worth people's attention too. I wish I could remember its precise title at this moment, but it suggests not only that technology is going to transform teaching and learning, but also that it's going to transform the politics of education. Well worth attention.
It's been my observation in a lot of fields that change is happening while we're talking about it. It's true now in the health field, and it seems to me when welfare reform was being debated, it was already happening. And now, talking to both of you and listening to both of you, it is hard to keep up with things that are shifting and are going to change politics and finance, but more than anything else, these institutions. I was interested, and we particularly wanted, and thank you for this, Doug, to talk today about EMOs and CMOs, and you did a good job of doing that. That it's, and that's why we used in the title, Mom and Pop. Mom and Pop, the idea being that you're out there all by yourself, and now there is this networking, I don't know, movement, but that's really I want to ask you, Doug, and Checker too. How extensive is that? And what do we think about EMOs? Neither of you mentioned EMOs, which are profit-making networks. So where is it in terms of networking, and what about EMOs? Doug, why don't you go first?
Sure. Maybe to take the EMO question first, I think like any other operator, like CMOs, like mom and pop charter schools, they're a mixed bag. There are great mom and pop charter schools, there are mom and pop charter schools that should be closed tomorrow. There are great CMOs, there are CMOs that should be out of business tomorrow. EMOs are all over the map. I think that for-profit tends to be a highly emotional idea for people, and it tends to be a distractor to me. People have made money in education for time immemorial. Textbook companies are for profit, and some people question their motives, but most people recognize that they provide a service. More interesting to me when I look at the history of the EMO sector is capital structure. Sorry to get all business MBA-ish about this, but when I think there's a big difference between a privately held EMO and a publicly held EMO. I don't think, to me, the most successful EMO in the country has been National Heritage Academies. When you look at their results, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're privately held. When you have a single aligned private investor, that investor can make a long-term decision about building quality first. I think Checker made the winning point, which is any movement is only going to survive if it's all about quality. And for too many people, it was about, in the early stages, growth, and it was about growth because they had institutional investors in the heady VC days of the late 90s expecting a 20% return on capital in a few short years, and the only way to do that is to open schools with 1,000 kids and put them all over the country and take any charter and open it with any principal, and that's death for any system that's trying to provide educational quality. So I think for-profit is a little bit of a red herring. I think capital structure is something that I don't hear many people talking about, but it's much more interesting to me than whether people are making money, how it is, whether they can align their investors around making a long-term decision.
Checker, comments on?
First, he quotes a Harvard Business School professor, and then he talks about capital structures. You can take the boy out of the business school, but you can't. Doug might have newer data here. The last data I remember seeing is that roughly 20% of all American charter schools were part of either EMOs or CMOs, and about 80% were not. Now, there are a lot of other networking arrangements that don't quite qualify as either a CMO or an EMO, and back office operations, shared services, things like that. So if you added all that together, they're probably a much larger fraction of charter schools are participating in something larger than the one building, self-contained school. But it's still not the overwhelming majority, by any means, of charter schools in America. Thinking about Ohio, where we've got National Heritage, which Doug just mentioned is possibly the best of the EMOs, doing a at least competent job in the schools that I know. We've got 2 Edison schools in Dayton, biggest charter schools in town, doing one of them's doing a competent job, and the other, they're twin schools. It's really interesting. One is doing a competent job, the other is doing a mediocre job. And then we've got the biggest source of political problem in the entire Ohio charter movement is an EMO called White Hat, run by a political businessman whose crummy schools and political shenanigans have helped to give the charter movement a bad name across the state, as well as, I think, not doing a very good job of educating children. So it's a mixed bag indeed.
Let me ask one more question then and open it up. So you can be thinking about how you want to jump into this. The standards movement is the source of a lot of federalism confusion. We specialize in federalism confusion here. We have plenty of things to look at. And in the case of No Child Left Behind, there's a dynamic that makes you want to keep your standards low so you can achieve performance according to the requirements and not be hassled and be threatened by the government, federal government, reducing your funding. And now in the Recovery Act and in other ways, there's more push that seemed to be implicit, I think explicit also, in the $787 billion Recovery Act with the requirements for the emergency funds for schools. Let me ask the question, what do charter schools have an influence? Now that they're bigger and you all people in the business have learned a lot, to push up standards or to in any way help or pull back from the idea of measuring mania and standards as a way to do better in our schools in a world in which we're often faced with strong systems that we, in effect, compete with. So standards in charter schools, the big picture. I ask you to go first, Checker.
Well, I already said one point, which is I think on the whole, the standards movement has been compatible with charter schooling in a healthy way. The charters are more the recipient, or somewhat might say victim, of what's good and bad in standards than they are the drivers of it, I think. If a state adopts low standards, for example, as many states, far too many states have done, then those are the standards by which the charter school is going to be judged by the state, just as the district schools will be judged that way by the state. That's not particularly good for the charter sector, nor for anybody else, in my opinion. Though Wisconsin announced yesterday, I believe, that in the current school year, Wisconsin's always been an amazing case study here, believe only 3% of all the schools in Wisconsin have been deemed to be in need of improvement under the No Child Left Behind Act as of yesterday. Well, what that says, as anybody that's driven around even just Milwaukee could attest, is that the standards in the state by which it is using to judge its schools are ridiculous. And this would be true of the standards as they apply to charters as well. Other things apply to charters too. If the state and the federal government are only interested in reading and math, it is the inevitable consequence that schools will de-emphasize art and music and history and civics because they're not externally accountable for that. On the other hand, if the state standards, or someday maybe national standards, are well wrought, high, broad in the sense of curricular, this will be good for charter schools. I guess I see this more as charters being led than leading.
Led than leading. Doug?
3 quick points. I don't know a great school, whether it's a district school or a charter school, and I feel like I should just want to make it clear that there are a lot of great district schools out there, and I'm just as happy to see them as I am to see great charter schools. I don't know any great schools that are not unapologetic about the necessity to teach standards. They see them as necessary but not sufficient, but all great schools recognize that they have to be intentional about what they teach and that some things are more important than others. I also think there's a positive ancillary effect to the discipline that you get from managing for a very clear bottom line that has a positive ancillary effect on your ability to manage for other marginally less clear bottom line outcomes that you're trying to achieve in your school. You get used to managing for a result, for an outcome, for building a culture around it, and then when you're talking about other things that you want to do as a school, it's a positive effect. So I don't know that I think charter schools are driving the standards movement, but I think it's been tremendously positive, certainly for us, and certainly for good schools, be they district or charter.
Very good. Open it up to questions. Say who you are, and if you would. And Michelle's got a microphone.
It's a question to the Doug. If you put up the first scatter chart, scatter graph, you'll see this, right there.
This one.
There are about half a dozen schools in the upper right-hand quadrant, all the way up. Is anybody in SED or Mayor Bloomberg or the charter movement looking at those schools? Because what you have there is basically 100% poverty, assuming these numbers are real.
Yeah.
I mean, on the actual test results and not phony or fake or whatever. Those seem to be the models that anybody would want to use. I mean, how can you have a school that's 100% poor and is at maximum effectiveness?
It's a great question, and I think that is exactly the question that we should all, district or charter, be asking. It's possible that those are magnet schools, is one thing I feel like I should just say, which is I wasn't able to control in this data for schools that select their applicants. Or
one of them is Stuyvesant.
Yeah, well, and also for schools that inherit, kids who are sort of cast out of the district system, and that's probably what some of the outliers here. And my assumption in this data is that they probably balance out. But I think if this was Silicon Valley and we were looking at this data, we would all be engaging in industrial espionage, trying to get into the upper right-hand quadrant and figure out what they were doing. And that to me that's a great thing. Well, maybe not the espionage part, but like the trying to understand what the upper right-hand quadrant. I mean, I think that to me that's the solution, whether it's district or charter. I do think that there's a part of the charter sector that's been just there's a open source sort of agreement that makes it easy for me to call any charter school leader in the country and say, "Can I come visit your school?" and not have to explain why and have them spend the time to show me around. And I've tried to call district schools, and I occasionally get the same. Actually, the district superintendent in Rochester is exemplary. We have a great, Chucker, you mentioned failures of district and charters to work together. We have a great relationship with Rochester City School District. They're fantastic, and they're totally open source. And I think that's exactly where we should all be trying to go, is to figure out what's in the water in those schools.
Those scatterpots are good. And Checker?
I agree.
That's it? Nothing more from Checker?
I mean, the point's right.
That's where we should be looking and going, and hopefully you are. You're realistic but optimistic, I would say. That's what I hear. Other questions from the audience? Person in the back, Michelle?
Checker, if you could outline or expand a little bit about the sole authorizer, why you think that's such a bad idea?
Sure, it's always a bad idea to have a single door that can be opened or shut or slammed for whatever good or bad reason. whatever political or substantive reason or absence of reason, whatever quirky, idiosyncratic individuals might happen to be on charge of the doorknob. It's just a bad way to do it. I mean, the worst charter programs in the country, without question, are those where the district is the only authorizer. And where if you want to start a charter school, the only possible way you can do that is to get the district to sponsor you. Because invariably, except for a handful of enlightened districts, that has meant the answer is no. We don't want any alternatives. We don't want any competition. We don't want anybody doing anything different. We want to be in charge. We want to be in control. And those are sole authorizer situations. And almost every state that started that way, incidentally, has discovered that if it's serious about charters, it needs at least one alternative statewide type authorizer. Colorado's moved in that direction. Florida's complicatedly moved in that direction. It's, if you want any kind of marketplace, you don't want a monopoly. It's almost as simple as that.
And the assumption that public monopolies destroy value less quickly than private monopolies, I just think that's a broad assumption.
Other questions?
Scott Waldman with Times Union. Can you speak a little bit, Doug, about what you have planned for Troy, and how are they rolling out the red carpet? Because as Tom and Chris can attest, that hasn't really happened here in Albany. Are you getting a warmer reception there? Are you going to be one and done?
Yeah.
Or are you going to have a lot of schools?
Are you riding on a wooden horse, by the way?
So all we can ask for, I understand why a district would be would not get out the trumpets and the balloons when we pull into town. The superintendent of Rochester City School District said, all I want is more seats and better schools for the kids in Rochester, so he offered to help us expand, and we don't expect people to greet us that way. Our goal is to convince districts that we're a good thing. Our first thing that we did when we went to Troy was Paul Powell, who's the principal, who's in the audience tonight, and I went to the superintendent and we said, we just tried to have a really cordial conversation. And what he said was all you can ask for, which is he said, you're the competition, and competition is different from being the enemy, right? People compete collegially and to their mutual benefit all the time. And he said, my goal is to run better schools than you and not to attack you and vilify you. And so far, he's held to that promise, and we certainly intend to hold to that promise. From our perspective, we all do the same work. We're all trying to educate kids better. We hope that we can work together to make it happen. And we're just, we're optimistic. And so far, they've been totally fair to us. So that's all you can really ask for.
Are you going to have any more schools over there, or just the one?
Right now, we have one charter. That's our plan. That one
I
great
want to ask
charter.
a follow-up to that. In Rochester, you've got one school and a happy situation. In Albany, there are many, and there's been a lot of tension. And I wonder if it would be interesting, I'd like to get some numbers. When Jonas Charchuk was here, he had some very good numbers in his presentation. And I think a very good place to start, Doug, would be if you tell us about uncommon schools. The CNO, you've got, well, I'll let you give us the numbers. Where are you now? Where are you going?
16 schools. We hope to be within the next 5 years at about twice that size, which would make us the equivalent, almost the equivalent of one of the big five. We would not be all in the same place, but we would be the size of a district, good-sized city school district. So.
Where are they and who are you?
So there are 4 of them there are in Newark, New Jersey. There are 4. There'll be 5 next year. There's 1 in Rochester. There's 1 in Troy, and the rest of them are in Brooklyn, New York, and Bed-Stuy, and assorted other neighborhoods of high need. And so we're regionally focused.
And where you're headquartered where?
In the headquarters is in New York City, and we're not planning on expanding to new geographies with the possibility of, if there are. My theory of opening a school is when I find when there's a community of immense need, where I feel like I can make a difference and I have a great school leader, or if it's a really great school, I'll consider starting a school. So it's conceivable, but I wouldn't go outside you couldn't, because I wouldn't go more than 2 hours from my home, because I feel like my principal needs to call me and say, I need you here tomorrow and I need you to be there. So it's 2 hours from Albany. It's possible that we would try another market.
Did you say you're the fourth biggest of the CMO networks?
I have no idea.
How many are there? Who's bigger?
KIPP is bigger. KIPP has 60 schools. Aspire Public Schools in California has 20 or 30. Achievement First is comparable to us in size. Who else is in the CMO sector that's...
Jonas is in the back there, ask him.
I don't think anybody's that much bigger than those that we named.
You had numbers, Jonas, and I was talking earlier today about your presentation and the statistics you presented. And I'd like to move the conversation a little bit now to numbers. How big is the charter school movement? Where's it biggest, and how big can it be and should it be? So maybe you would like to comment or provoke or whatever.
I provoked enough last time.
No, you were true.
So actually, I think Checker mentioned earlier where there are over 4,000 now nationally. In New York State, there are 115 charters currently running. SUNY has 49 of those that are currently operating. Let's see, in terms of numbers, I mean, so those 49 equate to about 17,000 students. So I think you can extrapolate from there to figure out sort of statewide where we are. Let's see, what other numbers we're interested in? In terms of CMOs and the largest state to state. California by far has the largest number of schools. Texas, where I was most recently, has an alarmingly large number of schools with very little oversight. Unfortunately, that's one of the states that sort of falls into that category Checker talked about with very little sort of accountability after folks are let in the door. But yeah, New York is I would say more moderate in its number, but you know, and this may be a bit self-serving, but a little higher in terms of the accountability of those schools.
Nationally, it's about 2% of all kids.
That's what I wanted to ask you. So
exactly.
where can it go, Checker? Where do you go for 10 years now, the next 10 years?
The reason the 2% is misleading is in the District of Columbia, it's 35% of all kids. In New Orleans, it's 50+% in the peculiar circumstances. In Dayton, it's about 30% of all kids. Charters are concentrated in urban America, by and large. Despite the small town in Colorado I was talking about earlier, those are not big numbers. In urban America, I think this could become very significant.
What's very significant?
Who knows? I mean, if you're at 40% in New Orleans or the District of Columbia, what difference does it make whether you're at 50%? It's an alternative to the traditional district that is in fact accessible to pretty much everybody in town if they want it. Once you can say that about an alternative structure, I guess I don't much care whether it's 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%. If everybody who would rather have this option can get it and it's working well.
Is the higher percentage in places that have greatest needs, and is that the way we should think about what's desirable? Greatest needs in terms of Doug next.
I wish. The numbers have so much more to do with the caps and constraints and opposition and politics than latent student demand. If latent student demand were the only control here, I think you'd see a very different picture.
What do you mean by latent school demand?
Latent student demand, how many kids would rather have this alternative than the one they've currently got if this alternative were available to them? We don't know how big that is.
And they would need, what about need? Are the highest New Orleans situation something special, but are the higher percentages in places that have the most troubled urban schools?
yes and no. Again, the other factors that put on the brakes here are so profound. I mean, Detroit, for example, has at the moment a very small number of charter schools because politically they've kept them out. That may just be starting to change now with a new mayor. Just be starting. But there's also a statewide cap in Michigan that's operative that would keep them from growing in Detroit. So I can't think of a city in the country with greater need for alternative decent schools for its kids than Detroit, but the supply isn't allowed to flourish there.
John?
For me, scale should exist only where need and overwhelming quality overlap. So the question is...
Good economist answer, but how about implementing it?
I mean, I think that there are places with lots of schools where they're not very good, you know, I don't think a school is any better because a bad school is any better because it has charter in the name.
I get more questions. I'm learning a lot, but I got more I want to ask. I'll tell you what they are. You can think about it. One is the movement losing its zip? Are people not as interested in it as it used to be? And second, how does the movement, the charter movement, fit with other big issues in education, like virtual schools, like standards, like money, whatever you want to pick? Those are things that occur to me as I'm trying to get educated here, and I am. But there are a lot of other people in the audience. I'm looking at Tom when I say that, or anyone else who may want to chip in a question before I put my final questions, and hopefully I won't forget them, but I probably might. Jonas?
Yeah, I apologize for getting here a little bit late, so if you covered this, just tell me to sit down. The question I have is, we focus a lot on the power of boards in terms of the eventual success of a charter school. And I'm interested to hear from both of you, based on your experience with both mom and pop and CMO-led schools, sort of the relative difference in your mind of how critical the board is, and basically how you find we talked about sort of finding the teachers and the principals, how you find the right fiduciaries for these schools to make sure that you have great stewards.
Well, in a mom and pop situation, the board is absolutely crucial. Because it's the only source of anything resembling a continuous future or a continuous improvement plan. We had as an authorizer a situation, a mom and pop situation in Cincinnati, where what was the highest performing charter school in the state of Ohio, which we were proud to be the sponsor of, essentially collapsed when its principal left under a bad cloud, I have to say, and it turned out that the entire instructional program left with him. And there was no infrastructure remaining, and the board had so depended on this person that essentially the whole thing went into a state of collapse. All the air went out of the balloon. That's because it was a hero school. Without anything to sustain it other than the hero. Heroes occasionally get struck down by slings and arrows and indictments and you name it. Then you're left with, I'm not going to make a local reference, you're left with sometimes a collapsed balloon. So the board's very essential, is absolutely critical in the mom and pop situation. The CMO situation, if the CMO has the infrastructure to be smart about staffing and back office operations and so on, it can survive, the school can survive a inept or lagging local board.
John?
I guess I would say that boards are incredibly important. We're lucky to have what we think are boards that have an incredible amount of value. They are and should be the first line of accountability, and I would just say we are lucky in New York State to have authorizers who are not afraid to close dysfunctional or non-performing charter schools. But that's a very efficient and brutal to implement tool, and a much better tool for accountability is an effective board. The other thing that I would say is we try and obsess about efficiency in everything that we do, and one of the challenges we face in growth is we're replicating boards. The rest of the education sector is eliminating boards and consolidating boards, and we're replicating boards as fast as we can. So increasingly, as we grow this network in upstate New York, I'm going to spend a whole lot of my time going to board meetings instead of running schools.
Closing schools, Checker, is that harder in other states, done or not done? Should be done more, should be done less?
Very little school closing for academic results has occurred in the charter sector, and this is a failing of the charter sector. Most of the school closing that has occurred in the charter sector has been for other reasons of malfeasance, financial shenanigans, a whole lot of craziness that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with, though it may correlate with, weak student performance. And where I would fault the authorizers, most of them in the country, is for not taking severe action on the basis of academic performance of low-performing charter schools. Now, having said that, let me repeat something I said earlier, and again, speaking as an authorizer. What do you do, to illustrate with a vivid case in point from what we lived through, when this dismally performing charter school is the school operated by the largest African-American church in town? And it's an important part of what they regard as their sort of multiple ministries and missions to the community. Pillars of the inner city. And well-intentioned, decent people who just happen to have made some really bad leadership picks at that school. And as a result, the school's performance stinks. But do you close this school? It's not an easy question.
I'll ask my final question. I'll get one more question, then I'll ask my final question. Person back there. Allison. Allison's our education director here.
Hi. Could you speak a little bit more about the kinds of functions that the overarching network might take on, how those are similar to or different from the kinds of functions that a district performs, and also a little bit about how they might vary from one kind of network to another?
Doug should answer that question. All I'd point out is that they're not geographically bound. I mean, his organization has chosen to stay regional, but the fact of the matter is, this kind of virtual system that we're talking about is unrelated to geographic districts, and therefore can be thought of as a completely different institutional invention in American education. I think quite an interesting and potentially very promising one, but he should answer the rest of this.
So a lot of the things that we sort of categorize as operations, which some people call back office, but which I think is actually sort of demeaning to them. And incredibly, there's incredible amount. Schools are businesses that have to be run. So finance, operations, compliance, back office, all those things are incredibly important. And if there isn't a home office to do them, essentially the principal does them. Or if you have a business manager, the business manager reinvents the wheel every time there's a compliance report or an operations challenge. So that's a lot of the value. But as we've grown, we've actually the portfolio of services that our home office provides has grown mostly into professional development, which I know a lot of great districts do also. But training teachers at scale across our schools, new teacher training, training for master teachers, how we do leadership training. All of our principals do a fellowship year where they do a residency following a great principal around their building and sort of learning the craft firsthand for a year like a doctor would. And that's now orchestrated and managed by our home office. And the last thing they do is, Checker talked about brand, and brand is really important to us. And I think people are probably skeptical of brand, but I would just say Harvard is a brand. And there are lots of brands in education. For us, brand helps us recruit teachers. If teachers know that they're going to work in a great environment where they're going to love working, where the results are going to be tremendous, or likely to be tremendous, then it helps us to recruit teachers. So a lot of our teacher recruitment functions happen from our run and managed by our home office as well.
KIPP's punishment for a bad school is they withdraw the brand.
Yeah.
They don't close the school. They say you can no longer call yourself a KIPP school.
I'm going to save my question about the next 10 years and has the zip gone out of the movement for you to talk to these two characters about afterwards, but there's one more hand up. I'm going to give that person the last question, and we're at the end time. So this will be the final question, then you can corral one of these speakers or one of the people in the audience on the good education you provided to us today. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Nathan. My name is Tim Creamer. I'm with the New York State School Boards Association. Spent 19 years with the Ohio School Boards Association.
And then you fled the state.
And then fled the state. This is true. And I just have a couple random thoughts that came to mind as I was listening to you. First of all, I want to thank the Rockefeller Institute for this opportunity. I think it was Mr. Finn who said that there is too little dialogue occurring between traditional public school factions and charter school factions, and he's absolutely right. There is much we should be doing, talking and sharing, and I know that there are things I could learn from them as I did today. I would hope there'd be some things that I could share that would be of value to them, and we should be doing much more of that. And I'm glad to see that this perhaps is a start. It reminds me of a conversation I had with Tom Carroll one time, where he came to me. Tom, you may remember this. I'd said that you said that one of the things that was perhaps one of the elements of success for your charter schools was the quality of your boards, and thought I might be surprised at that. And I took that very seriously, and we actually did a research paper that talked about, at least posed the question of what about pre-qualifying boards of education members, appointed boards, things of that nature. Landed with a big thud with my audience. I thought you might be interested. The other thing I wanted to mention was the gentleman up here, the first question asked about who might be looking at that upper quadrant. And there is a group called Just for the Kids. They're out of New Albany. You probably know of them. I don't know if any of those schools that they're studying are up in that quadrant, but that's what they're trying to get at. Who's beating the odds? And so to what extent that would be useful to you, I don't know. My question, after all of this, is I'm worried that you're taking a little false comfort in thinking that the teacher union movement is going to be bypassed because of technology issues. What's to stop teacher unions from really targeting union school or charter schools, and what's to stop charter schools from making that happen?
I mean, Americans have a right to join a union, and unions have a right to try to organize unorganized Americans into unions. And that will continue. As you know, the large tendency of the last 3 decades or more in America has been for union representation in the private sector to reduce and union representation in the public sector to increase, such that the largest and most powerful unions in America today are no longer, as I think we've just been observing, the United Auto Workers and the Teamsters, but rather the various public employee unions. And that's likely to be with us, that phenomenon, for forevermore. And the unions are enterprising. They've recruited teacher aides. They've, in some cases, recruited cafeteria work people who are not teachers, and they'll continue to do so. I think Doug's original point, though, I would stand by. If educators feel rewarded and compensated and like they're in a healthy, productive workplace with colleagues they like, doing something they love, and seeing some results and being rewarded for it, they may not need the additional security of a union. I expect unions to continue to do their damnedest to survive, but I'm just saying there are a lot of large-scale trends in contemporary society that are going to make at least the traditional model of unionism, with its sort of local bargaining units, district-wide contract as sort of its core structure. I think that's going to be under serious assault from many directions.
Final comment? Or?
I'll leave it at that. It's great.
Thank you both. Thank you all for coming.